Hey, AP Human Geography students, welcome back for Friday's lesson. My son was very intrigued last time when he helped us, and so he was thinking about movie quotes, and he said, you know, if you build it, they will come. So a little shout out to Iowa and Field of Dreams. And so we have built it and we are glad that you are here. I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen over to today's lesson. Those of you that were with Miss Lindsley yesterday, you saw that she gave us a couple FRQs to go over today. So I'm going to try and do those a little bit quickly because we've got a lot of stuff to cover. This is a great opportunity, and I'm going to say it multiple times, for you to, if you're practicing, you're writing stuff down, to reach out to your teachers. You can share the link with them and tell them just the first couple minutes and then have them give you some feedback. I think that that is a great way for you to connect and work with your teachers as well. So for those of you that don't know me or are new to this, my name is Kristen Brandt. I'm from Glenbard West High School. We are going to be using Slido.com. And so if you were with Miss Lindsley yesterday, you saw we switched to a moderated format just because of wanting to make sure that we're able to monitor what's happening. My daughter Kennedy is going to try and help kind of push questions over to the best of her ability. It's tough when we've got hundreds of people on at one time, but it at least we'll answer some of the questions in real time. And the other ones, make sure, again, it's a great opportunity to reach out to your teachers and say, hey, this crazy lady from Illinois was talking about this. Can you explain what she means? It would be a great way to form those connections. So today we are going to talk about source analysis. And so we're going to look at some qualitative data and how it can be represented in maps and images and landscapes. Super fun. And so I thought, well, get to know me just a little bit more. This is a postcard that one of my teachers gave me. I went to school up in Minnesota. It is up in Minnesota, but up in Bemidji, Minnesota. So I don't even see, there's my stuff, way up here. And up there, you'll see a wild rice casserole. And so wild rice is growing up there. Casseroles and hot dishes are part of our culture, the potlucks from the Lutheran church dinners. And so we'll talk a little bit about that impact on cultural landscape. My siblings live down here in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, and a good old tater tot hot dish with some cream soup mixed into it, or a green bean casserole with some cream and mushroom soup. Typical things we would find in those areas. And so the reason I started with this, if we're talking about sources, that even something as silly as this can also give us some insight into the geography of an area, the history of an area, the culture, and the in some cases even, and my dog is barking at a squirrel, so I apologize. But even just kind of the community feel of that area. So the dog totally threw me off on that one. So I do want to start with our warm up here, and we're going to warm up with Miss Lindsley's lessons. And so yesterday she was talking about kind of how we're going to use these different our skills. And so one of the questions that she posed to you was, looking in 2018, China had the world's largest population and India had the second largest population. So when we say identify, remember, we are going to have you identify some information, but we're probably not going to have you identify. We're not going to have you define anything, nothing that you can Google. So it would be something that we'd probably have you just identify from here. So for example, what are the two types of data that you see? And so, typically, that are used to calculate the rate of natural increase. Well, you would say death rate and birth rate are used to calculate the rate of natural increase. Done. So to describe what the total fertility rate represents, you would talk about how many children on average that a woman can expect to have in her lifetime. And so you may choose that this is, you could describe it and say, typically is higher in less developed countries and lower in more developed countries. Using India's rate of natural increase shown in the table, describe how to calculate the doubling time of India's population. I'm not going to lie, my students would have trouble with this because I tell them not to memorize it. Don't panic if you get a question like that. Do the best that you can, try to explain it, see what happens. The correct answers would look at 70 years divided by the rate of natural increase. So in this case, it would be 70 years divided by 1.4% would equal 50 years. It would take us 50 years to double that time. So that's how you would calculate it. But I think you could work your way through it without memorizing all those numbers as well. Using the data shown in the table, describe the ability of China's population to replace itself over time. And so here what you would talk about is you would talk about that it's going to correctly describe the ability, table shows that the total fertility rate is 1.8 and the country's population should remain stable. And so that idea that that total fertility rate is not replacing itself. And so it is really, it's going to be difficult for them to replace it quickly. It's really what we would talk about. It suggests that it's unable to replace itself over time and that ultimately the population should decrease. When we talk about E, China's population statistics are unusual for a country with an economy that's still in the process of industrializing. Absolutely. And so here what we would talk about, we have an unusually high population, regardless of what type of economy that we have. China's death rate is unusual because it's similar to that of countries of fully industrialized economies. Its low birth rate is similar to that of an industrialized country. And so part of that is due to their natalist policies that they have had in place. We could talk about that the rate of natural increase is unusually low for a country, industrializing countries. And what I would say when you say explain, so why is that? You could talk about how, still roughly half the population is engaged in agricultural activities. And so we still see sometimes some larger populations in rural areas, but the smaller populations in urban areas. And so there's a contradiction of terms here in China. Okay, and then the second one, so another practice one that she gave you. So here the map shows major rivers and mountain ranges, desert regions. You can read it as well as I can, but it says identify what each point symbol on the map represents. And so this wouldn't be something you Google. You actually just look at the map and you would say, well, 1 point equals 1 million people. Put that in a sentence. Great. Number 2, describe 2 topographic features that are shown on the map. So you could talk, you're identifying. So you'd identify, you could say the rivers are not labeled. If you knew them, great, but you wouldn't be penalized. But I would say the Gobi Desert, the Talcamalcan Desert, Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, that those are, you would just identify what you see there. 3, describe 2 ways that the topography affects the spatial pattern of a population distribution shown on the map. And so the 2 things, that should jump to mind, definitely the clustering, the density along the coast. And so you might talk about how it is higher along the rivers or the coast because that's where water is available. The soils, the climate are suitable for agriculture. You could talk about trade as well and movement of people along the river. Another thing you could talk about where it's lower, take a look at the Himalayas or Tibetan Plateau, it's harsh climate, lack of suitable soil for agriculture. The Himalayas or the Talcamalcan Desert, it's dry, it's arid, it's just not suitable for large numbers of people. And then number 4, describe the way that the availability of natural resources may affect population distribution. So you would say in areas of sparse natural resources, so harsh climate, lack of suitable soil for agriculture, lack of fresh water, population is more likely to be sparsely distributed. And so you could also talk about that. Sorry, I was just telling my daughter to click over. So you could talk about, you could talk also about when we do have availability, that is going to, so those resources, just the opposite of it, are going to encourage population as well. So there are a lot of questions about FRQs that just popped up that are going to show that you have questions about that exam. And so, Kennedy I'm going to kind of advise her to just we'll look through a couple of them that's something that might jump out. So she's looking right now as I'm talking about, but here's what I will tell you. Again, talk to your teachers. There are many different ways to tackle this. We can't go through absolutely everything right now, but that week before the AP exam, we are going to spend time, Miss Lindsay and I, so I'm going to take 2 days, she's going to take 2 days, and I'm going to proctor an exam to you, and we're going to do it in timed resources, and then we're going to dive into those answers and really kind of tear them apart, and that's going to be your opportunity to ask a lot of the nitty-gritty questions about those that AP response. And so just keep looking for those types of materials. You know, I would say there was a question that did pop up, you know, the total. So, you know, talked about the total fertility rate. If it's under 2, it's typically, no matter if it's close to 2, you're going to see that population decline. Because if you think about it, replacement rate is technically 2.1. If you have 2 parents and they have only 1 child, that's not replacing the 2 of them. And so having 2 parents, 2 kids, that's how that replacement comes into place. So technically that's where that answer comes from. Okay. So here we go. Today we're gonna dive more into source analysis, okay? And so we're going to dive more into this. And so what we're going to focus on, these are the key words that we see on the side. So identify, describe, explain, compare. Those are the main task verbs. The 5th task verb that you could have been asked is define, and we've already said that's not going to happen. So what do we mean by that? So when we talk about identify, we just practiced it, okay? So find an answer, number of possibilities. So indicate or provide information about a specified topic. A lot of questions came up last time. Can we Google things? I'm going to tell you don't. Just don't even go down that rabbit hole of Googling anything, because if you end up in the wrong place, it can invalidate your entire test. Identify, typically it means we're going to want you to look at the map, just like I did where the 1 dot equals 1 million people. So that's the type of identify, kind of think where that one's going to be. When we ask you to describe, give a detailed account, including reasons or causes. You know, sometimes you might be like, oh crap, what was that definition again? And so what you might do is maybe you have your notes from your class handy. Nobody can stop you from doing that, but you're not going to have time to look up everything. The best thing you can do is practice your vocabulary. So get online, maybe do some online Quizlets, so even though we're not going to assess you on it, but get that brain going. What are those vocab terms? Explain. So here what we're talking about, remember, we're talking about give that detailed account, those reasons, those causes, those relationships. Here's where your examples are going to come in. And then ultimately we get to compare. And I know Ms. Lindsay highlighted this yesterday, a lot of the compare, we're talking similarities and differences when we talk about compare. And so that's, we're going to kind of keep moving forward. So Ms. Lindsay thinks you're absolutely correct that you won't have to identify. Could you please clarify? So what she means by identify is, I highly doubt that if you're gonna identify anything, you're gonna identify something you see on a map. We have no secret knowledge to these exams other than they've told us you can't Google it. Just like that practice one, that came from my AP. That identify where a dot equals 1 million people is an identify. I mean, that would kind of be like a free point. You should be like, score. I just don't know if you're going to get those types of questions. So we're guessing you're not going to get a lot of identify. We're probably hedging. You're going to see mostly describe, explain, and compare. So great question. Okay, so the source analysis should come as no surprise. It shows up in a ton of units. And if we were teaching the last 2 units as well or assessing it, we would see it in our urban unit. We definitely would see it also in our development/industry unit. But I'm going to just focus on the units that we see source analysis really kind of embedded. And so we're going to do a little bit with culture, a little bit with political, and then dive back into agriculture, everybody's favorite unit, right? So what is it we really need to know? You know, the question here that I will say, so 2 things. We're going to get a lot of, I really, Kennedy, you can put that one over. Can we Google? Nobody's standing over your shoulder telling you not to. Here's what I'm going to tell you. You end up in the wrong chat. Even if it wasn't intentional, it can invalidate your entire score, and your name can be reported as someone who participated in unethical practices, testing practices. It's not worth it. You don't have time to look for that stuff. And so you're right. I mean, we can't stop you, but if I will tell you, we've already caught a kid doing some other stuff, trying to set up some chat rooms, and we're just telling you, just don't even go down that path. So a couple things. Is the exam open book? I mean, I guess technically you can use your book. Again, don't count on it. If you've ever taken an open book test or open note test in your life, you don't have the time to look everything up. You gotta practice. And then finally, should we spend time reviewing units 6 and 7? The videos that Ms. Lindsley and I did that were kind of the big overviews really were, finding those connections, because the reality is talking about urbanization, don't spend time looking at the models, but understanding that rural to urban movement, that is in actually unit, oh good Lord, 2, population and migration. In development, that idea of talking about levels of development, well, we also talk about that in unit 2 with population. So if you really hit, I think, unit 2 hard, you're going to have the foundation for everything else. And we're going to talk on next Wednesday. I'm going to really hit the demographic transition model hard, and my goal is to show you how it connects to all those other units. Okay, so the first thing that we look at here is we talk about the introduction to culture. And so where it wants us to focus really is we're going to focus on this idea of kind of, what type of information is even being presented. And so we could look at, we talk about introduction to culture and what are some of those cultural traits. I mean, I like food, and clearly it's getting close to dinner time, so I'm hungry. So I started thinking about, okay, food, how might we represent this? And so I showed you my Minnesota one with my casseroles and hot dishes, but we could also quantify here. We take something qualitative and quantify it. So we could talk about, I love this, the top ranked Thanksgiving dish. I mean, could that be any more cultural, right? And so we take a look at, in the Midwest, the mashed potatoes. We take a look at the rest, it looks like stuffing. And you can look at the other images here. But it's interesting, if you ask my students, I have a student who, his family's Italian, and he lives here in the Chicagoland area. And guess what? They always have spaghetti and meatballs at their Thanksgiving dinner, because that's part of defining who they are. And so we could map out other foods, as you see down below, the fruit salad, mac and cheese, green bean casserole that I mentioned earlier, and salads. But we could also look at these restaurants. And so you're taking something qualitative. So what tends to be a trait, that food, I could have pictures, I'm telling you, there's some great images out there too. Like I had a map, I just can't use it because of copyright, but I had a map that had the different chains throughout. So I would see, like in California, the In-N-Out burger, or how do you know you've entered the South? Hello, you see Waffle Houses everywhere, right? But this was interesting, because here's what I started to think about too, is kind of even what resources are available. That if I look at seafood along the Southeast, well, think about it, they're on the coast. And so you're going to see more regional cuisine, burgers, hello, the steakhouses. This is where your cattle, your beef. And so we're going to eat that. In Wisconsin, we could talk about brats. It's not on there, but that's part of that German tradition about who settled there. And so there's that connection then to migration. And let's just be honest, I'm sorry to those of you in New York City, but Chicago deep style pizza is the winner for best pizza. I know I'm making you all groan right now. Sorry. If you've never had Chicago style pizza, it's pretty fabulous. Not good for you. There's a reason when we get to our maps later about obesity that we see some of that in the Midwest. But take a look at, we've been using the term Tex-Mex, so down along the border. That should make sense as well, because you see more of an immigrant population from Mexico as well. So one of the questions, quantitative versus qualitative. And so quantitative, we're talking about numbers. Qualitative typically is kind of these bigger concepts. So how can we then quantify it? And I think this is a really good example. So I'm going to show you. So the timing of that question is absolutely perfect. And so here it says one of the most popular home styles in Western United States. So this is definitely qualitative, right? These are images. We're seeing where we're going to find the Mediterranean style home. Why do we see that there? Well, think of the climate, think of Mediterranean climate. Typically that's that, and who settled there. That style of home is also typical of things I would see probably in Greece along the Mediterranean Sea there. Ranch styles tend to also be really popular, partly because we don't have to worry so much about heat rising, and we can kind of distribute that throughout the home. And modern style, I think if we looked at wealth, we'd probably see some connection there, kind of progressive areas. We talked hierarchical, I guess we could connect it. If we take a look at what, LA and kind of Hollywood and the role that plays. Versus if I look in the South, okay, so again, qualitative, I'm just looking at, here's some images. So Southern style, so I'm looking at, you know, I think that European style, so the colonial homes, you could find the Victorian homes, but this is heavily going to be dependent on early settlement. And so it's going to be very reflective of things we would have seen in Europe during that time period. I think the other thing we would talk about is what resources were available. And so homes were typically built out of going to be a lot of timber just because that was available. If they're bricks, typically we're looking for what materials are there. Okay, so those are going to be qualitative. Now watch. We can quantify. We can map out. We could actually put numbers to this as well, but we could look where these trends, you know, finding a Cape Cod, you're going to find a lot of that in the New England area. And so we can kind of map out where we see those numbers. We can see this proportional symbol map, see the different sizes of the circles. And so I'm not going to ask you to memorize this. And some teachers spend a lot of time because they're really interested in architecture. It's great. It just makes you go a little more in depth in that area. The whole idea here is that we're trying to define the culture, okay? So I am not going to let her put a ton of questions in. So I know that there's some pressure to put some in, and so she's rolling her eyes at me right now. And so no, because it gets a little bit tricky. And so you don't, you know, should you know that the popular and folk style houses of a region, you could. Again, you don't have to stick to one example. Typically, the examples are going to, if we talk about folk or pop culture, you can use other examples than just architecture too. So if this doesn't interest you, you could find other examples. Where we find, though, is there's still this divide. There's a divide between the haves and the have-nots. We could talk about income distribution. Here I'm talking about the digital divide. We're going to talk about, you know, this, we take a look at the people that are online versus offline. So we talk about access. None of this should be completely surprising. You might be a little surprised. This was in 2008 with China. You know, a lot of that is kind of the moderation too. You start talking about a unitary government versus a federal government. And so kind of the role that plays. Also, you take a look at Ethiopia versus just the access and wealth to some of that, those things. So this also, when we talk about wealth, sometimes manifests itself in our cultural landscape as well. And that's going to be our next section. This I thought was really interesting that I found, you know, the global Gulf supply. So why talk about Gulf? You could talk about it in terms of our landscape, which I'm going to show you in just a second. We could talk about it in terms of business and wealth. It's not a cheap sport. It is something that where we see business, a lot of business deals that happen. So this is an opportunity for you to just kind of see where, okay, we see a lot more golf courses in more developed countries, but it doesn't mean they're only there. And so when we shift to cultural landscapes, why are we seeing them develop in other places? And we're seeing them develop in other places because this is that means of wealth and I would say of business opportunities. So this, I'm not going to lie, I have to check my notes because I do not have them memorized. And so one of the things that we look at is you could look for patterns. We talked about this earlier in our lessons, and we take a look here of where the homes are. And so look at some differences here. So this is in Chile. The next one is in Germany. Here's what I found interesting. Take a look at Germany, and it looks like it butts up to some farmland as well. Feels like much more open place, where Chile's feels like they plunked it right in the middle of that city. So then I start thinking, well, I'm wondering if this is kind of like an island of development here. Is this where we're going to pool all of our resources so that this is where we, you know, kind of these primate cities. So this is where all of the resources go, and we bring all of the business people in. Where Germany, we know that they're an MDC, and so we can afford to put this out in other areas as well. This one is Kenya. And you can definitely start to see here the green, where they're spending money on watering some of this versus the drier areas as well, kind of that encroachment. This here is in China. This one I just thought was kind of interesting, very uniform looking homes. You see the river, you see some of those resources. So when we talk about cultural landscape, that's a question that just came up. Remember, cultural landscape, that definition is that visual imprint on the surface that humans have made. So a human made visual imprint, like the mark that we put. Yes, students do get confused by this quite a bit. Mine do too, they get it wrong all the time. clearly I stink, right? So, but this one I thought was interesting in Bahrain. Look how dry that is, you know, and you talk about those arid areas and think about the resources you have to make that grass super green that has to go there. So we talk about, you could talk about environmental issues, you could talk about what they value as well. Okay. You know, this, I think there's a couple, one of the questions that I think I saw um, you guys talked about was, can you use kind of local or personalized examples? If you're able to connect it back to, you know, I've been talking about Chicago examples, or I could talk about the role of golf courses in business. You know, it's really about how it connects to geography, then absolutely. You know, if you talk about that you're where you live, you have no, you know, I think about where I grew up in rural Wisconsin, we didn't have access to a lot of things. And so that could just be my starting off point into how it connects to geography. That idea of global land use. So clearly we were just talking about those choices that people are making to use the land for golf courses versus this is, I thought, interesting when we start talking about how we actually do use the land. You're going to really like the next map. I'm super excited about the next one. But this idea of here's how much the land surface, here's how much we occupy, you know, this is where we can actually, we use, you know, 50% for agriculture and some forest. You don't have to memorize any of this, but just kind of in the back of your head, think about how we're using and how we're losing some of that. This to me is the really cool map. So what they did is they took how we use our land in the United States, and they did exclude Hawaii and Alaska when they did this study. And they made, for lack of a better, I hate to use the word cartogram here because they're not putting completely, they try to put it in the United States shape, but the size, if you really look at those squares, they're trying to put, this is what it would look like. And so this is what they say how we use our land. And so if you take a look up in the Northeast, it doesn't mean this is the only places that are urban and commercial, but out of all of the contiguous United States, that's how much land we use for urban commercial. Take a look at Florida. This has grown by, and I want to just double check on, so I'm giving you the right numbers here. It's grown from 28 million acres to 40 million. It is now bigger than the state of Florida of the 100 largest land owning families. So that to me is crazy. We look how little land we use for food we actually eat. The pasture, which should make sense, the cow pasture that we have so much space. If you think of Van Thunen's model, right? We use that large area. So this is just a different way of looking how we use our land and that idea of the landscape. So do you need to know the difference of golf courses around the world? No. Again, that's just an example of how we could use some qualitative, those images and analyze the topography. We could talk about wealth, we could talk about, what else did we talk about? We talked about business, we talked about the use, that environment and the water. And so you want to be able to, it's all about those connections. This is not a course that you can memorize your way through. You have to be able to think and apply those concepts that your teachers have been teaching you all year long. So here's another good example. I'm sure your teachers talked about sequent occupants. Probably the favorite image that your teachers showed there, at least that I show my students, is where I've got a picture in Italy where I can, you show, either the Colosseum and then some newer buildings. I use a ton from Europe where you show kind of like these traditional places and then you have the modern buildings in the background. So it's that idea of layers over time. But these I thought were kind of interesting, something new to think about. So on the left here, where you see these 5 columns, this is actually in Oregon. So this is what the land looked like in Oregon with the indigenous. And then as the pioneers moved in, then kind of the commercial agriculture moves in, then we take a look at industry moving in, and then ultimately postmodern. And so how that's evolved over time. The one on the right is an image of Chicago. And so I chose this one because this is so cool, the Water Tower Place. So if you don't know, Chicago survived we rebuilt after a pretty massive fire, right? And who started it? I'm not sure. But out of all seriousness, this idea of the water tower surviving, and then you see these beautiful modern buildings. You can even find these iconic buildings. This one I just thought was really pretty, but you can find some where you can see the John Hancock building in the background. And so that idea of those layers, and so part of the history, but also the modern world as well. And so that idea of the ability to rebuild and being able to talk about how we kind of define our areas. Anything? Okay. So another thing that they talk about, you have seen gender in every kind of unit. And so in the cultural landscape, how can we see gender? And so we can talk about this idea of women in the workforce. And so we can talk percentages, which is totally qualitative, right? We're talking numbers. So here's the percentage of women that are working. I thought this was interesting here that talks about that generally gender parity is a good thing, but sometimes higher percentages sometimes are more necessity, and it doesn't necessarily mean choice or equality. And so that's really where we have to do a little digging then into the landscape, into the culture, and understanding what it, and we would start to look for other indicators as well. And so here's one. This was from the Pew Research Center that we have actually seen, going forward, we're starting to see men and women employment kind of getting closer together. If we pulled in data and wanted to look at pay, there's still a discrepancy there. But this is the piece that I think is interesting, that we still see women in some traditional jobs. And so this is where we would say, okay, how is this reflected in culture? And so we definitely, these tend to be some of, when we start looking at kind of in the United States, we're going to see, very few women in HVAC, and I forget exactly what it stands for, heating and cooling industry, refrigeration, mechanics, installers, civil engineers, very few. But, take a look at speech pathologists, physical therapists. We're seeing those numbers. We could have put up, nurses or teachers as well. But that idea of then how's that changing that landscape? How's it changing the culture of those areas? Okay. One of the questions here that I think is good, that talked about sequent occupants occurred at different cultures, came to the area. It can also show that. It can show development over time. It can also show different cultures coming to an area. It's not just limited to, it's layers over time. And so it could be cultures, it could just be development as well. And we see these manifest themselves in a lot of cultural patterns. And so this is one of my favorites, right? What do you call that what you drink, right? What do you call it, pop? Do you call it a Coke? Do you call it soda? And then we start digging a little deeper, and you're like, what's going on in Wisconsin? How come it's kind of connected to St. Louis? And so then I might think about, well, there was the migration from the south to St. Louis. We talk about steppe migration. They stopped there. Some continued on to the Milwaukee area. And so there's some trends there that maybe we find some links. A lot of it, even if sometimes you're wrong, but your thought process was right in explaining, you're going to be okay. Because what we want to see is, are you grasping why and how things happen? That I wish I would have found one that was nice and neat, about water fountain versus bubbler versus cooler. Is it kind of, where's that influence, the European influence on an area? And so this is really more about, when we talk about these generic soft drink names, it's really about kind of those regionalization as well, and those patterns of those terms. Part is language, part is settlement. The quintessential example is we take a look at Canada, and you take a look in the left one here, that French is cited as the mother tongue by 60% more of the population is green. The red is where English, we see, definitely we know populations concentrated across, near the border of the United States, the Great Lakes. You could talk about conflict that comes out of that, potential conflict. I think the map on the right then just gives some hard numbers. And so if you take a look at where we've got kind of the qualitative, those hard numbers, but isn't it much more powerful when I look at the colors to kind of see where those trends are? Well, then it starts to make sense why Quebec is having some conflict versus the rest of the country where they see more English speakers. It does manifest itself in signs, where I'm going to see both English and French. And so that's kind of what we'd want you to be able to see is how do we take numbers, how do we visualize them, and then how do people see it in the landscape? I love talking about kind of some of the trends that we see in the United States. This is probably a map many of you have seen, because there's an FRQ question that I used to use with a retired one that I used to use with my students. We talk about, can you identify what religion, by looking at the gray, if you didn't see the key, would you be able to say that that is either Mormons or the Church of Latter-day Saints? If you saw the orange, would you be able to tell me without seeing it that that's where, you wouldn't probably have to be able to say the Evangelical Lutheran Church, but could you say that Lutherans were located up there, or the Baptists in the South? So that's something that we do want you to be able to visualize those trends. Again, know that if we were talking scale, I can't help but not talk scale. It doesn't mean every single person in that county is that faith. What it means is that that's the overwhelming majority. But then we talk about kind of how does it manifest itself? How do we see that back in that cultural landscape? If I was up in Minnesota, you're in Wisconsin and the Dakotas, you're definitely going to see some of those. You're going to see more churches. You're going to see potlucks. You're totally going to see some lutefisk feeds. You're going to see different things kind of popping up as that are definitely reflective of that Norwegian culture. Same thing in the South. Like, not only do you see the Waffle Houses when you come, but I will tell you, when my family and I drove to the South, like all of a sudden the big crosses. Everywhere we went, my daughter's nodding her head. She's like, yeah, because the Baptist church, very wanting to make sure that their faith is first and foremost. One of the questions that just came up, can I explain possibilism? So remember, determinism, I'm going to start with the opposite first, because determinism, remember, the environment is determining, and it's kind of dictating how we're going to do things. And this is going to come up again next week. Possibilism is that we make those accommodations and we make those adjustments. So we talked last week about building the levees or the dams in order to use that area would be more of a possibilism versus determinism. So one of the things that we also see with religion, should you know settlement patterns of different religions in countries? Here's what I will tell you. Definitely in the United States, yes. Should you know kind of some European trends? And what I mean by that, I'll show you in a second. Should you know that Catholics tend to be in Southern Europe? Absolutely. Should you know Greek Orthodox or Orthodox, if I was looking in Russia or Greece? Should you know Protestants in Northern Europe? Absolutely. Should you know where Sunnis versus Shias are located in the world? Absolutely. Hindus? Absolutely. You should know those trends. Absolutely. Another trend that you should know is that we are seeing that I would say globalization is having some impact on, it talks about percent of residents who are religiously unaffiliated. And so this is looking at different cities across the United States where we are starting to see, we see number of people, religious places, we see some popularity versus kind of religion kind of struggling to find its foothold. And we talk a lot about secularism or globalization kind of taking people away. You don't have to go to a church anymore. I can watch it online. I don't even have to assign one faith over another. And I think that's causing some shifts in our culture. And so you're starting to see that more in our landscape. Other things that you're starting to see, this is in the United States, which is traditionally a Christian, founded on Christian values, we are seeing an increase in mosques, right? And so that's a change in the cultural landscape. I want to do a little shout out to any of our students that are Muslim, because I know that this is a difficult time for a lot of you as Ramadan has started. And so the fasting has begun from sunrise to sundown. And so, make sure those of you that are not, that be supportive of your friends during this time. So not only are they at home, but it does make it a little more difficult as far as kind of how do we practice some of these things too. And so we're seeing that change in our landscape. But we do see religion's important to people in these areas. And so we look at kind of to the degree of importance. And that's what I mean about that change. And so we're starting to see that all over the world. And so is that because of that time-space compression, so that internet distance doesn't matter as much. Are we starting to see, definitely think how busy we are in developed countries, and so we're pulled 5 million different places. And so when we look at in LDCs or our nations in transition, where we see religion's very important in those areas, is that because one, it gives hope. One, there's more time to really focus on it in some cases. So there's a lot of different things that you could kind of go down and talk about those ideas. That idea of diffusion, and so this question just came up again, do we need to know all the religious groups and their locations and their backgrounds? You should know the big ones. I'm not going to lie. You should be able to look at a map here, and if I didn't have the key up, you should be able to tell me where Christians are located, where Muslims are located, where right now it says China is where it, sorry, right, I don't know why they're unaffiliated, but you could say Buddhist, in those areas. And so I guess the point is that definitely you should know that, and you should be able to talk about that idea. Just don't do it, Kennedy. You should be able, sorry, I was caught on some of the questions. You should be able to talk about the why there, what are they, how did they get there? One of the questions that just came up, why is religion not seen as important in MDCs? And so we're talking about that idea of we're seeing a rise of secularism, we're seeing a rise of kind of that globalization. So things that are taking you away from the church instead of putting the church into your life. And so we're just seeing that's a struggle right now. When we look at images here, when we take a look at those shapes and that architecture, it's part of that landscape again. And so you should be able to say, and I did choose some kind of obscure ones on purpose. But on the left, when you look up here, this is actually a Lutheran church in Iceland. But you probably should be able to guess Christian. Down here, you should be able to probably guess this is actually in Italy, and so Catholicism. And so hopefully you're able to do a mosque here. This is in the UAE, Orthodox. This is actually in Greece. And so I know that the Greek Orthodox Easter was just recently as well. And then we take a look over here that, you see the Hindu temple. This is actually in Bangladesh. And so that idea of its imprint on the landscape, there's some beautiful images out there. Do you need to memorize every single one? No, but it's having just that awareness of how it reflects the culture and the religion. And so talking about language gets tricky because when we talk about language, that idea of spreading through migration patterns. And so here we take a look at the dark gray, countries where the majority of people speak an Indo-European language as their mother tongue. And so we talk about colonization, you talk about migration, you can talk about trade. There's a lot of different reasons why we see that. And then ultimately, how is it reflected? And I thought this was really interesting, the number of internet users by language, that take a look, around the world. Yes, there are other languages that are used. The Chinese should not surprise you when you talk about 1 billion people, but also government censorship when you talk about, when we talk about different government role or influence on those areas. So I just saw a question that kind of popped over. So that idea of secularism and indifference sometimes to faith, that idea of, do we have to specify the structure of Catholic or Christian? Most likely you can just say Christian. I hate to say, you might never have to say Catholicism if they're connecting something, but most of the answers you're going to be okay just by saying Christian as well. Okay. So political geography, when you look at this map of Europe, you should be able to say, if I asked you about nations, so ethnicities, and its ability to coincide with borders should make you think about nation states. And you should be able to say that in Europe, historically, we have seen that. If you're in France, you tend to speak French and you have a shared culture. Now, it's not everybody, but typically that's what we've seen over time. Yeah, And when we've seen some of these multi-nation areas, so where former Yugoslavia used to be, we know that balkanization occurred in order to try and create more of that nation state feel here. People are going to struggle. And so sometimes if you don't, when those lines don't coincide, we see things such as the Kurds that, one of our largest stateless nations, so things don't coincide. And so we take a look at the resources that they in the land that they occupy, and not having that unified voice makes it really difficult and for this group of people to kind of move forward. But it's not just them. And I think sometimes we talk about that impact, that visual impact. And I'm not sure that Miss Lindsay or I have talked about in the United States, the indigenous population, so our Native Americans and the reservations that we have seen, that are scattered throughout. And so that idea, we'll talk more about scale on Monday, but you kind of take a look at where they're spread throughout the United States and the history that forcefully moved them to those areas, and then the impact that they have on that land. And so we could zoom in and we can just take a look at Texas and kind of where those areas are. But I really, since I grew up in Wisconsin, I came across these maps here too. And so taking a look at the different tribes that are here, and so they kind of zoom in and we take a look at areas. And so I will say that the Ho-Chunk actually, in where I grew up, not all these areas, but where I grew up, they actually have established a casino on their reservation. And so kind of how the rules operate, this is before we've seen more casinos throughout other areas, because remember the type of government structure that is allowed in those areas. And so we can look, though, if you've ever traveled to these areas, you'll definitely see that visual imprint on there. And so really, when we talk about patterns and distribution, the type of land, typically it tends to be a little more isolated, tends to be land that probably we did not push them to the prettiest and best land possible. Do Kurds have their own language and religion? As far as religion, no, but their own language, yes. They're going to have a shared culture, and so that's what makes them definitely a nation. Okay, we've got one last section here, and we are kind of running out of time, so I want to keep us moving forward. So this idea of settlement patterns, and we've talked about this before, but remember, it's about that visualization. So when we talk about settlement patterns, there's some great ones in your books that probably talk about how the center of population continued to move across the United States. This is just kind of another visual representation. So in 1790, you can see where population was clustered along our East Coast versus 1876. And then if we look at today, we still see that densely populated areas there, but we also see densely populated areas along our West Coast. And so you might talk about different entry points, Angel Island versus Ellis Island. You might talk about chain migration as well. So definitely we see more Chinese immigrants coming in through Angel Island versus more European immigrants coming through Ellis Island. People tend to, we've talked about this, that sense of place, that people aren't typically leaving the areas where they first enter, just because this is where that idea of home is. But so when we take a look at then that visual imprint, as we did expand westward, we talked about township and range later on. And so we talked about at one point, and so that idea of how do we survey, how do we divide up that land? And so when we divided it up, this was one of the ways we did. And how do we know? Look at that grid system. And so we take a look at those farms in the grid system. And so that idea of kind of making our squares versus in Europe, a lot of times they use the meets and bounds or the long lot system. But the meets and bounds, that idea of using your landmarks, the rivers, and so you don't see the beautiful like grid system here, but you're definitely going to see as that visual imprint to the right, where you can see kind of a little more erratic visualization of it. And then finally, golly, I hope this is the last one. I totally got ahead of myself here. When we talk about source analysis, they talk about the second agricultural revolution. So you should in your head be able to go, okay, I know that this is when we start using more machines, mechanization happens in our farming. And so I'm not going to focus necessarily there. It's kind of a byproduct of that. And so what we've seen is definitely total fact, if we look at productivity, we take a look at how we're looking at this annual growth through these areas and using technology, and how it's just kind of taken off. And we see that growth in the agricultural sector we see it starting to take off in all developing countries except for sub-Saharan as much. In part is just wealth. Being able to compete with that technology really causes them to lag behind. But hang on just one second. So how do we see that? Well, we see it distributed in our different food services. We see it in forestry and our farms. So types of things that we're using the mechanization in, we see productivity gains as well. In particular, we may not see as many people working in there, but we know that they are producing more. And then this is the kicker. Why is it important? Bam, more calories. We're able to produce more. We're able to give more, a consistent base of food in order for people to what? Live longer. So in all these areas, that connection between mechanization, that idea of, yes, we have less people working, but yes, we're producing more, means people then did shift into factories, shifted into urban areas, and are going to have better and more stable supplies of food, which thus also help to increase life expectancy, plus also better access to healthcare. Okay, so we do have some challenges with all of that. Challenges, we are losing some of our, the reality is some of our land, and really there's a lot of pressure placed in California. We know that areas that are at risk as well, just because as these are coveted areas, and so we definitely know that there's huge pressure placed on this land because of urban growth as well. We know that even in urban areas, we could take a look at those food deserts. And so that idea of, look at these low income households on the left that are more than a mile from a grocery store. Well, how do you eat healthy? It makes it really difficult if you're not living near those areas. We could take a look at obesity, and we talk about kind of areas where we see more of that. And then we just talk about your healthcare indicators that we look at. And so this idea of taking a look at diabetes. And so the reason I put these maps up is just an opportunity for you to say, okay, how are we visualizing some of these trends, and then what connections can we make? So yes, we know that there's some good things that have come from the second agricultural revolution. We're producing more, but people do question how we've done some of that. And so the GMOs are a byproduct of the green revolution. So now I'm shifting to the green revolution. And so where we genetically modified that use of pesticides and herbicides in order to produce more. But at the end of the day, the idea was, how do we make sure that there's enough calories going to those in the developing world as well to sustain this population, this ever-growing population. Remember, go back to the question that we had earlier about possibilism. So it is taking a look at, how do we make sure we're providing for them? And so we've made adjustments. So how is it the average calories for a day is still 2,000 calories, and there's a large gap between the rich and poor? So remember, there's many, many people in Africa that are not getting the 2,000 calories. So that's where that problem is. And so that idea of the haves versus have-nots, and then that idea of taking a look, and so that's where scale is going to become really important, that we'll talk about on Monday. Yes, the green revolution would be considered our third revolution, absolutely. Characteristics of the food desert, remember, are areas that, and I forget the exact number of miles, but within X amount of miles, you do not have access to fresh produce. You're just going to have pretty unhealthy food. Typically, you're not going to have a grocery store, a full functioning grocery store. Okay. And so when we take a look at those GMOs, though, there has been a lot of pressure then to kind of clean some stuff up, because, especially from MDCs. And so we're seeing an increase in organic land use. And I'm not going to spend as much time on this, partly because we're running out of time. And this has been stuff that we've covered before. It's just, there's just so much, because human geo is absolutely everywhere. I would challenge you to spend some time, and hopefully I can bring some of that in next week, to spend a little more time kind of looking at the connection between these organic operations and where they're growing as trends in the world. And so we spent a lot of time talking about different sources here today, and really kind of telling a story, finding those examples, explaining, really trying to dig into some of that. And so this, I think, is a pretty great FRQ for you to practice. And so you're going to see an image on, this is Quebec, Canada. So the image on the left, we definitely are looking at some agricultural land versus the image on the right, taking a look at the kind of that urban landscape. And so we're going to go over that on Monday. And I will be leading you through it, but we're going to talk about kind of what are identifying some of those features, and then describing one way a country's physical landscape can influence that, and then also explaining how a cultural landscape shown in one or both of the photographs conveys a local sense of place. And so this is a great example how you could be assessed on some qualitative, but also being able to connect it to some other ideas. The more you're talking about geography, the more you're thinking about it, the better that you're going to be. And so today is actually the last day. If people are struggling with technology, we want to make sure that you do reach out to College Board. But today is that last day, because we've got to be able to start prepping, getting you ready for stuff. So we've got one more week of review, and then we're going to practice some FRQs with you guys. We're so thankful you tuned in. I'm sorry this one was so long. There's just so much to cover, but hopefully continue to reach out to each other, continue to ask your teachers questions. They're desperate to talk to you as much as you guys are to talk to them. We love hearing from you, so make sure you reach out, you say hi, and ask them some questions. They would love to help. So have a great weekend, everybody, and hopefully I'll see you on Monday. Bye.